Okay, so the vertebrate digestive system is specialized, so it has different areas, but the food moves through a continuous tube that we call the alimentary canal. In vertebrates, it looks like this. In other organisms, it looks a little different, but always you start at the mouth and end at the anus. The mouth is really just the opening right where your lips are, and then to be correct, when something's in your mouth, it's actually in your oral cavity, and then you chew it, you mix it with saliva, and then you swallow it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It goes to your pharynx. Your pharynx is the very back, like if you stick your finger all the way back and touch the back of your throat with your finger, which is not pleasant, I wouldn't suggest it, but you would be in the pharynx. Specifically, you'd be in what's called the oropharynx, but that space goes up and it goes down. So food could go in there and up and out your nose, although it generally goes, down. Swallowing pushes it down, but the esophagus is after the pharynx. There's an opening to the esophagus and there's an opening to the trachea right next to each other. It's kind of like this fork in the road where food is supposed to go down the esophagus, air is supposed to go down the trachea. So in order to prevent confusion, there's a flap, sort of a lid, that covers the trachea when you're swallowing. That's called the epiglottis. Epi means on top of. And so the epiglottis is a structure that covers the glottis. The glottis is just the opening to the trachea. And that way, when you swallow, food has to go down the esophagus. When you breathe, air goes down the trachea. Really, the esophagus is kind of always tight. And so when food gets pushed into it, the food is squeezed through the esophagus through contractions called peristalsis. Although it is possible to swallow air, but you really have to work at it. But the air is supposed to go down the trachea, food is supposed to go down the esophagus. If you're laughing and eating at the same time, though, your epiglottis might be opening, it might be flipping up and down, and you could accidentally get some food in the trachea, which is choking. Now the trachea is more like if you touch your neck, if you push on, you can feel on your neck, the trachea is in the front. So it kind of feels uncomfortable if you push on it. The esophagus is more on the dorsal side where you're towards your spinal cord. So trachea faces on the ventral side, esophagus on the dorsal side in terms of orientation. Now, once the food moves down the esophagus, it gets to the stomach. There is some digestion that happens in the stomach, but no absorption of any significance. The small intestine has both digestion and absorption, especially in the first segment of the small intestine. And then the rest of the small intestine is primarily absorption. The large intestine mainly removes water from the material to make it more solid. And then the rectum is the very last segment of your large intestine is muscular and it can push the waste out. Then you have the accessory organs. So what was on the last slide were the organs of the alimentary canal, but now the accessory organs are the organs that produce additional fluids and enzymes and secretions. And really, I should have listed salivary glands. I don't know why I left that one off. So salivary glands produce saliva. Liver produces bile. The gallbladder stores the bile and then releases it when it's needed. And the pancreas builds what's called pancreatic juice, which consists of hydrolytic enzymes and bicarbonate buffer, which neutralizes some of the acid that's made in the stomach. Okay, so let's start with the mouth. Stomach Saliva contains digestive enzymes. You remember, or if you haven't watched yet the lab video, there's 3 kinds of glands, salivary glands. There's called the parotid, which is in front of the ear. There's the submandibular, which is underneath the bottom jaw, like underneath and inside the bottom of the jaw. And then sublingual is under the tongue. And you have these on both sides. And these make saliva, which is a liquid that includes some enzymes, particularly amylase. Amylase breaks down starch. It breaks down the glycosidic linkage that holds the sugar units together. So there's some initial digestion in the mouth. There's no significant amount of nutrient absorption, although some drugs can be absorbed in the mouth, but nutrients per se not. This space here, let me get my pointer, this space here, so here's the tongue. It's actually a pretty large structure. It's all muscle, and then this space here is the oral cavity. So the mouth itself, if we're going to be technical, is just the opening and where the lips are. And then the oral cavity is here. And then behind that is the pharynx. Now the pharynx extends up here. This part is called the nasopharynx. The part that's behind the mouth is called the oropharynx. And the part that goes down into deeper down is called the laryngopharynx. So you have sort of 3 parts of the pharynx. But it's kind of the space behind. So that's why I was saying if you stick your finger in your mouth all the way to the back, you would be in the pharynx, specifically the oropharynx. And that's why if you drink something and you start laughing, you can spray it out your nose because it's all connected. It's also why I've seen some of the testing they're doing for COVID, they put a swab into your nose to get a swab from the back here. That's probably not very pleasant. But in any case, that's the pharynx. Now the pharynx has a name similar to another structure called the larynx. Yikes. Why did they name it that way? I don't know. Nobody asked me. The opening to the trachea is called the glottis. The cover, this tissue that can close over the glottis is called the epiglottis. And then the larynx is the first section of the trachea, sometimes called the voice box. The front part of it is also called the Adam's apple because for some people it kind of protrudes through their skin a little bit, but that's the larynx. So larynx is kind of the first part of the trachea, and that leads down to the lungs. Pharynx, though, is this part up here, higher up, I would say. And air comes down the pharynx and down into the larynx, but food goes through the pharynx and into the esophagus. So the pharynx would be common for both. That's going to be a really common point of confusion for students. So if you get that straightened out now, that's one step ahead. You can be with other students. All right, so like I said, in the saliva there are enzymes called amylase, and that breaks down starch and carbohydrates. A little bit of lipase, but mainly the amylase. Remember, sugar is your body's preferred source of energy. And so it kind of makes sense that your body would have enzymes ready to go right at the beginning. If there's any sugar there, it wants to get that digestion going. But anyway, those enzymes are made and then released into the oral cavity. When the food is chewed up and made and mixed with the saliva, we call it the bolus. I will have a little video for you to look at. The bolus is that ball of chewed up food. and then you swallow it. Now, swallowing is, the initial step of swallowing is voluntary. So when you go, "Gah," that's voluntary. But then what you don't know, or what you don't pay attention to, is the food continues to be squeezed all the way down that esophagus. And it moves to the stomach that way. And those muscular contractions are involuntary. So the saliva lubricates the food. Have you ever tried to swallow something when you just didn't have enough saliva in your mouth? It's virtually impossible. You have to then take a drink of water or something, because you just can't swallow dry food. It just doesn't work because it needs to slide down. The contractions of the esophagus need it to slide down. It needs to be lubricated. Now, the production of saliva is called salivation, the release of it anyway. That's controlled by the nervous system. And kind of a famous Russian scientist did some studies on salivation, specifically in dogs, and his name was Pavlov. And what he did was he rang a bell every time he fed his dogs, and then he started ringing the bell without feeding them, and they started to behave. They started salivating, and they knew that there was food. But he was looking at the salivation, which is a physical event, and so it's very Pavlovian. That your brain will start to associate things and actually start having a reaction, like a physical reaction to something like that. If it links the sound of a bell to eating good food, then it starts to connect those two reactions together. It's interesting. Okay, so like I said, swallowing is voluntary at first. So when you first go, "Ugh," that's voluntary. But then it's, after that, the contractions of the esophagus are involuntary. Those contractions are called peristalsis. So when the food has enough saliva, the tongue moves it back to the mouth in a kind of a ball. There is another structure called the soft palate, which kind of flaps upward to block off the nose, and the epiglottis blocks off the glottis. So these things help to move the food down to the oropharynx, down into the laryngopharynx, and then into the esophagus, because you don't want to get food into your trachea. That's choking, and that, even if it doesn't cut off your air supply, it's very uncomfortable. You cough and cough and cough to get that out. So let's talk about peristalsis. The esophagus itself has muscles surrounding it, and it contracts. So if, like, the mouth is up here, so let me connect this to like a head. Oops, I guess that's the nose. Okay, so here's the guy. So food comes in and it goes down into the esophagus. Then this is the bolus here. Once it enters the esophagus, there will be a contraction of muscles behind the bolus, but that contraction works its way down, almost like there's an invisible hand squeezing from behind, and that pushes the bolus down the esophagus. So that's peristalsis. And what's down here at the bottom is the stomach. Okay? So the esophagus is just a connector to get to the stomach. The stomach in humans is below the diaphragm. So there's a little distance that needs to be traversed to get to the stomach. And here's a picture of the human digestive system. So the bottom part of the esophagus. This right here is called the cardiac sphincter, which I think is a little bit funny. Cardiac refers to the heart. I think it's because, and y'all can double check me, but I'm pretty sure the reason this is called cardiac sphincter is this is the one, it's not a very strong sphincter. A sphincter is a ring of muscle that contracts to close off a passageway. And the cardiac sphincter is not very strong. So sometimes when the stomach is churning, some of the fluid will go back up, and that's called reflux. And because your heart, honestly, your heart is, here's the diaphragm would be right here. So your heart is right about here, just above the diaphragm. And so when material goes up right here, you think that you have pain in your heart. You don't have a lot of nerve endings everywhere, so it feels like it's in your heart. It's close because your heart is right there, right above the diaphragm. So it's what we call heartburn. But the cardiac sphincter is right here, and it's not the strongest one, so that's why you get the acid fluxing back up the esophagus, and that burn of that tissue is what we call heartburn. So the cardiac sphincter. Over here on the other end of the stomach is what we call the pyloric sphincter. Pyloric sphincter. It's much stronger. A sphincter is a ring of muscle that can close off. I think I just said that. All right. So food comes in, the cardiac sphincter should close, the pyloric sphincter should be closed. So that gives some time for the food in the stomach to mix with the liquids that the stomach makes. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But after it mixes here, then it changes from being called the bolus to being called chyme. Chyme is much more liquidy. It's still food, but now depending on where it is in the digestive system, we have different names for it. So in the mouth, in the esophagus, and in the stomach, it can be called the bolus. In the stomach, it is converted from the bolus into chyme, and the chyme will travel through the small intestine, which is all of this squiggly stuff, and it has different parts, and eventually connects to the large intestine. The reason the small intestine is called the small intestine is just because it has a small diameter. It's actually a very long tube. The large intestine is much shorter, but it has a wider diameter. The first part of the small intestine is really kind of the critical part. It's called the duodenum. Some people call it duodenum, and either pronunciation seems to be correct as far as I can tell. The second part, and the duodenum is only about 20 centimeters long, so it's not very long. The entire small intestine is several meters in length, but the duodenum is the first part. It's kind of critical, though. The jejunum is the middle section, and the ileum is the last section. All of these sections, the duodenum is important because there's a lot of digestion and absorption happening there. Jejunum and ileum are mostly about absorption. However, the cells that line the small intestine and the large intestine both are called enterocytes. Entero, E-N-T-E-R-O-C-Y-T-E, which is a general term for a cell in the intestine. It has a special structure that gives it a lot of surface area, at least on one side of the cell. And so surface area is important because every point of surface area that the food contacts as it moves through all of this, all these structures, ensures that all the possible nutrients that can be absorbed moved across that simple epithelium will be moved across that simple epithelium. So anything that gets all the way to the end of this whole system and has not been absorbed, you can be sure that it just cannot be absorbed. It had plenty of opportunity if it had been able to be absorbed. So the waste that's released is truly waste. So it's a pretty efficient system. All right, so those are the three parts of the small intestine. Then the colon, which is the large intestine, has three parts. Ascending means moving up. Transverse means moving across, and descending means moving down. Then you have the little S, this little S squiggle. I don't know, it doesn't look like an S to me, but they call it sigmoidal colon. And then it might have overlapped here. And then the very last section is called the rectum. The rectum has muscles around it, so for squeezing. So the sigmoidal colon is after the after the descending colon, then sigmoidal, then rectum. And then anus is literally the opening to the outside. Okay, so what happens in the stomach? You get some digestion of proteins, and that's because there are enzymes that were released called pepsin. And pepsin is a particular type of enzyme that's classified as a protease, an enzyme that breaks down proteins. So you get digestion, which is hydrolysis, but you don't get any absorption. And you don't get any real carbohydrate or fat digestion, just protein digestion, and no real absorption of anything. Interestingly, though, you do have some drugs that get absorbed. So if you drink alcohol, it'll get absorbed faster than if you eat a protein bar. If you eat a protein bar, it won't be that the amino acids won't be absorbed until it moves into the small intestine. But the alcohol will be absorbed in the stomach. So it's interesting. It has this wavy surface inside the stomach called the rugae. And that increases surface area, but it also allows for expansion, almost like one of those garbage bags that has those, I don't know if you've ever had them, but they can like stretch. It has these like little stripes on it. So in this case, it's like these wavy structures in there that can stretch. But at this point in the stomach, once it gets mixed with the digestive juices and the hydrochloric acid, that's important, which denatures the proteins, then the material is much more liquidy, and we call it chyme. You can get a sore, like an infection, in your stomach. It's called an ulcer. They used to think it was just caused by stress, but now they know it's an infection of a particular bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. And interestingly, he likes to live in an acidic environment. Normally, an acidic environment is really not good for most organisms, but this guy likes it. So if you get an infection with this guy, you can get a stomach ulcer, which causes bleeding in your stomach. So the secretions of the stomach are mucus. So the mucus secreting cells, sometimes called goblet cells. Goblet. The parietal cells make the hydrochloric acid, and the chief cells. And that's what secretes, it actually secretes something called pepsinogen, which is an inactive form of pepsin, but then the pepsin is activated. Or maybe I should say the pepsinogen is activated, and that forms the pepsin, one way or another. That happens because of the pH. So it's pretty much an immediate activation. So the goblet cells make the mucus. Parietal cells make the hydrochloric acid, and the chief cells make the pepsinogen or pepsin. All right. So the stomach itself is, has these activities, the cells of the stomach. And it has, if you look at a cross-section of the stomach, it has these little pitted sections. This is a terrible drawing, but inside these pits are where the cells are that make all these things. They're kind of hidden in a way because the food will be out here, and then the cells that are making all these things are in these little pits. The whole stomach is coated in mucus, and that's so that it doesn't digest itself. I mean, that's how caustic these things are. So the mucus actually prevents the stomach from digesting its own body wall, its own organ wall, I should say. It's very interesting. All right, small intestine. Small intestine connects to the stomach by what's called the pyloric sphincter. So when the pyloric sphincter opens, the chyme from the stomach moves into the small intestine. And so the first section is called the duodenum, also known as duodenum. Then you have the jejunum and the ileum. Now, I don't know if these measurements are exact, but it gives you an idea. The first 25 centimeters, so 25 centimeters is what, 10 or 11 inches, if you do the conversion. So less than a foot is duodenum. But that's a real critical part. Jejunum and ileum are several meters long each. I'm not saying they're not important, but those are for absorption. So sometimes people will have portions of their small intestine removed. You're not going to remove the duodenum. That's a really critical part, but you could move some of this middle section. You could remove some of the jejunum or ileum. And what that's going to mean is that depending on how much is removed, you won't get as much absorption of nutrients from your food. So that's always, maybe in some cases it's done for weight loss. It's a really dangerous surgery though, because there's a lot of blood vessels in the digestive tract. So if you can avoid that, it's usually, well, I'm not a doctor, but I would advise against it. But in any case, they can remove some of that. But the duodenum receives the chyme from the stomach, and there are digestive enzymes. Most of the digestive enzymes are made by the pancreas. And what's interesting is the enzymes that are made by the pancreas include all kinds of enzymes. So you have the amylase. We usually call it pancreatic amylase to distinguish it from the salivary amylase we talked about in the mouth. And then there are lipases, which break down fats. So this is the first time you have a significant breakdown of fats. And then you do have proteases. These are called trypsin, not pepsin. But again, it's a protease. Trypsin is a protease. So you have something that breaks down carbohydrates, something that breaks down fats, something that breaks down proteins. So all the macromolecules are going to be hydrolyzed in the duodenum. And it's because the pancreas squirts these liquids into the duodenum. It's a little bit like a car wash. The pancreas is kind of on the side. It's called an accessory organ, but it makes these enzymes and then it squirts them into the duodenum as the food is moving through. The pancreas also makes bicarbonate. Bicarbonate neutralizes the hydrochloric acid. It neutralizes the acidity of the chyme, because the chyme coming in from the stomach is going to have a very low pH, and then the bicarbonate will neutralize that, bring it closer to 7. It doesn't bring it all the way to 7, but it brings it much higher than usually. I think chyme in the stomach is like pH 2, something like that. And then you have a duct that comes from the liver and the gallbladder, and it's called the bile duct. And the bile duct is what the bile travels through, and it also sprays onto the food that's moving through the small intestine. So you have the pancreas that's spraying things onto the food. You have the bile duct that's spraying bile onto the food. All right, and what bile does, we say that it emulsifies fats. And what does that mean? It just breaks large drops of fats into smaller drops of fats. Emulsification, emulsifies fats. Because fats tend to glob up together, especially in an aqueous environment. And so this breaks them into smaller drops so the lipase can really attack. Now the surface of the small intestine is ridged, a little bit like the stomach. The stomach has those rugae, these waves. And then if you look closer at each wave, you can see these individual cells So the waves are called the villi. And then on each of the cells, I don't know if you can see here, but they're circling one cell and they're coming in close up. The plasma membrane has waves. So not only does the organ surface have these waves, but each cell has plasma membrane extensions. The plasma membrane extensions are called the microvilli, and the waves in the whole organ and the surface of the organ on the inside are called the villi. And coming into each of these villi are vessels. Now the vessels don't go inside the cells, not the surface cells, but they go into the tissue that makes up the inner core part of the villi. So what's going to happen is monomers are going to be broken down in the space inside the small intestine, and then it has to pass through one of these epithelial cells, and then it goes into the circulatory system on the other side. So the villi are the folds in the wall of the organ. The microvilli are actually folds of the actual cell membrane of the individual cells. That's an important distinction. The names are similar. All of this increases the surface area of the small intestine. Because surface area, every point of a surface area of an organ is a point of possible absorption. So it makes sure that the nutrients are absorbed that can be absorbed. All right, so we said the pancreas makes trypsin, it makes bicarbonate, it makes lipase, it makes amylase. All of that is squirted into the duodenum. And the little tube that connects to the duodenum is called the pancreatic duct. And here's where I said that the pH of the chyme coming from the stomach is 2, but when it gets mixed with the bicarbonate, it brings it up. Not quite to 7, but you're in the pH 6 range, which is much better. Otherwise, the chyme would burn the small intestine cells because they don't have mucus covering them. And that would be a chemical burn. All right, I'm going to pick up with this on the next lecture segment.